Hi, folks. Welcome this evening. I'm Ed Friedman. This is Friends of Mirmini Bay's second presentation of the 29th year of doing Winter Speaker Series. I want to thank Martin McDonough, who's on the call, for being our Zoom and web coordinator for this. And of course, our speaker, Brian Check, who you'll hear from shortly. I also want to remind folks that our next event is December 10th, Return to the Sky, with Tina Morris, a wildlife biologist and author and ornithologist, and was the first person to really work on reintroducing bald eagles back to the Northeast quite a while ago. So that should be really interesting. And she has written a book of the same name, Return to the Sky. So hopefully you can make it then. Friends of Mirmini Bay is a very unique organization in that we're holistic in nature, and no pun intended there. But we engage in research and advocacy and protection and education. And a lot of our research is cutting edge, and a lot of it informs our advocacy, which is also cutting edge. So, go to the next slide here. We see the research slide now. Somebody tell me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, just some examples of some of the research stuff we do. It's a little bit dated. We've been doing a lot of work with PFAS in the last few years, particularly around the Brunswick Naval Air Station, but in general. And we have expanded our water monitoring, water quality monitoring this last year in a very intense way up further on the Androscoggin River, and using those data to try and upgrade the water classification that the state labels their rivers, well, all the bodies of water with. The Clean Water Act and state law prohibit degradation of water quality, but the only way that's really measured is by classification. So if the actual water quality is a class B, which largely relates to classifications largely relate to dissolved oxygen and E. coli bacteria. If the actual quality is higher than the classification, that amounts to room to pollute or degrade. So if I want to go and open up a factory and start discharging into the river, as long as I meet the current classification, I'm good, which in this case is class C, the area we're working on, but the actual quality is better. So we're trying to lock that in. We do a couple of bay days a year with hundreds of kids coming and doing hands-on environmental work out on the bay and field. We do stuff in schools as well. And it's very gratifying to have a fourth grader say, I don't want to stop. I want to be an archaeologist. Archaeology is one of the sessions that we often have. Protected a lot of land around the bay, more than what's on the poster here. And our focus is on valuable wildlife habitat as opposed to recreation trails. As I mentioned, we're recording this. If you know someone who missed it, or you'd like to recommend that someone see this afterwards, or want to forward a link to it, if you go down the home page on the right side, home page of our website, you'll see an education section, and down in there you'll see speaker series video list, and you'll click on that and you'll see a listing, and you can click on tonight's, and it takes you to our event page, and down at the bottom of that is the YouTube recording. And this is the calendar for this year's series. So again, Return to the Sky coming up next, and then some stuff on PFAS and noise, which is getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, and gastropods, slugs and snails, and then some interesting history, maritime stuff at the end. So Brian Check is the founding president of Center for Advancement of a Steady State Economy, fondly referred to as CASSE, signed on as executive director in 2017. Check was the first conservation biologist in the United States Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System, and spent years there as an Endangered Species Act policy analyst. He began with the service in 1999, and in later years, after receiving a Star Award, the Service War Special Thanks Award in 2010 for exceptional accomplishments, he became subject to gag orders because of his conversations on the conflicts between conservation and economic growth. Ultimately, this led to his retirement in 2017. Brian was, and may still be, I'm not sure, visiting professor of natural resource economics, Virginia Tech's National Capital Region locations. He's lectured at about 100 universities in about 20 countries. He's the author of several books, including Supply Shock, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and with Paul Krausman, the Endangered Species Act, History, Conservation Biology, and Public Policy, as well as author of about 50 academic journal articles. Brian has a BS from the University of Wisconsin, master's in wildlife from the University of Washington, and a PhD in natural resource studies from the University of Arizona. Jack's been designated an eco-champion by public employees for environmental responsibility, or PEER, an organization I recommend everyone support. They do great work. An eco-hero by EcoHearth, and one of the top 100 inspirational leaders by the Post-Growth Institute. So there you have it, Brian. Thank you again for being here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and people can say hi to you or vice versa. And we'll go from there.
Thank you, Ed. It's really great to be with this group this evening. I like to think that any friend of Marion Meeting Bay is a friend of mine. So,
we like to hear that.
And I really want to thank you guys as an organization. There aren't too many conservation organizations out there that do so much advocacy and action. And man, that's what we really need. So thanks for doing that. I'd like to sit in on the December 10th one, the Return to the Sky, and give a thank you to Tina Morris, because believe it or not, just today from my office in Arlington, Virginia, overlooking one of the last wetlands in Arlington, which has kind of been restored to have some open water. It's like a pond with wetlands, and we saw big mature bald eagle swirling around just right outside the window from the 10th floor there. So, you know, that's quite a success story. At least we've had some success stories in conservation biology, won some battles, but we're darn sure losing the war. And then that's going to be largely what the subject matter this evening pertains to. So let me bring up some slides here, and can you see that yet? Oh no, here we go. Share screen, slideshow. Now you should see it.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, when we talk about a steady state economy, folks that haven't heard that phrase or haven't heard much about it, you know, we ought to define it. And the way to go about that really is just to remind ourselves what economic growth is, and then put this in contrast with the steady state. So economic growth, you know, there's nothing magical about it. It's just an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And that's a really key phrase. So it's not just about having more bicycles here and less Hummers there. It's about the growth of the economy as a whole. And that's typically expressed in terms of GDP, or gross domestic product. And it entails a growing population and or per capita production and consumption. And as by way of a little further intro, I would guess that most folks in Friends of Marion Meeting Bay, I don't know if you guys call yourself Fombies. I don't want to take liberties with but there's a lot of syllables in that name. But in your organization, as in most conservation organizations, there really hasn't been much thought put at all to economic policy, much less macroeconomic. Macroeconomic matters and macroeconomic policy. So I think it's going to become evident in the course of the next 5 or 10 minutes why we at CASSI have chosen to do this, even though we come from a base of ecologists and wildlife biologists and naturalists and so on. All right, so then degrowth is pretty much the opposite of growth. It's a decrease in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate, expressed in terms of GDP, and again, entailing this time degrowth in population and or per capita consumption. And so the steady state economy is the only other alternative. You have three basic growth paths: growth, degrowth, or the steady state economy, which is stabilized production and consumption in the aggregate. And yes, you can express it in terms of GDP. And it makes it very clear that it entails stabilized population and or per capita consumption. Here that is graphically, really simply. In ecology, we use the K to represent carrying capacity for, say, the population of a species, but it certainly applies to the size of an economy. And so we know that growth is not sustainable, and degrowth certainly isn't. So that leaves that third option, the steady state. It's never going to be a flat-lined economy. It'd be fluctuating, hopefully not too wildly fluctuating, hopefully mildly fluctuating, and then ideally fluctuating around some optimal level. We'll get to the issue of optimality toward the end again. Now at CASSI, we wear this concept on our logo. Sigmoid curve, growing economy, stabilizing into a steady state. And I really like our logo because you're probably familiar with like nature needs half, and then the one that E.O. Wilson led for a while, the Half Earth project or whatever that was called. And I mean, we've been saying that for almost 3 decades now. Half for economy and half for biodiversity, and or we could call it the economy of nature, sort of the human economy and the economy of nature. So this has been kind of theoretical, conceptual so far, but let's just revisit what's going on the ground, and maybe some of these things a lot of you are intimately familiar with and others might never seen before. This is imagery over Kansas, where the Ogallala Aquifer is being drained for purposes of this pivot agriculture. And there it is on the ground. And it's a very factory farming sort of approach, not only in the sense of that extraction of massive quantities of water as that Ogallala Aquifer drains, but in the type of ecosystem, this really monotonous soybean, typically corn in a lot of parts of western Kansas. In this case, probably Roundup ready soybeans by now. Similar though in the major aquifers of the world where grains are produced, this actually in Saudi Arabia, pivot agriculture. This is a little more what it looks like on the ground there. This is in Qatar, to be more precise. And see, it's a little drier there, but fact is, in ecosystems around the planet now, even in those that used to be viewed as very hydrologically rich, let's just say, with plenty of water, there's water shortage because there's such intense agricultural activity, which you must have to support $107 trillion global economy. So, and as a result, largely of that $107 trillion worth of global economic activity, 80% of which is still fossil fueled. You're familiar with climate change more than most. And so we're having very challenging conditions over a lot of these areas that used to be a little cooler and a lot less dry. But that's just the agricultural sector, and we look at some of the closely related sectors, like the extractive sectors, like logging and the clear cuts and mining and the mountaintop removal and domestic livestock ranching and the overgrazing and factory fish farming, and then in each of these extractive sectors, you have built upon those uh, refining and heavy production and lighter manufacturing. And so, you start out at the mill, whatever, or the processing plant, and then you get lumber and you get finer, finer and finer products, basic stuff. Same thing in the steel industry, and get some heavy products out of that and lighter products and very, very light stuff like with jewelry. And then, and then there's a wide assortment of manufacturing types of activities that are built upon this array of extractive activities. I had to rack my brain to remember what the heck this was. This is a plastics factory, but they chose quite a mix. It almost looks like a water plant, but it's actually plastics and water mixed, which that's a hell of an industry, right? So, and now there's all kinds of even more mixed manufacturing, of course, for heavy and medium sorts of manufacturers. And then, in the transportation industry, various types, and more, the robotics are involved in this manufacturing activity. And, here you have a supervisor at least overlooking the robotics, but more and more it's the robots themselves that our latest book I got to make a pitch for our latest book off the Steady State Press. It's called Humachines, and it is about the the blending of biological and robotic components and processes and grid. It's pretty scary, but that's an aside for now. And then even the containers to ship all this stuff, to ship all these products, that alone has become quite an operation, especially with the rise of distributors like Amazon. Just its containers alone are quite a project. And then I think the point of this slide is all of that heavy and medium types of economic activity does lead into some very fine stuff that grades, you might say, away from goods per se and into services, in particular, information provision. So now we have these massive data centers. Some of them are related with the manufacture of computer chips and so on, although a lot of that's imported. And, this is like the next frontier, you might call it, or anti-frontier for conservation with these data centers, with the massive quantities of water and energy they require. And we had plenty of other type of, infrastructure to make all this stuff flow. The energy flows, the water flows, the producers and consumers flows. You might view this as sort of a representation of the circular flow of money. You have the producers going to work and the consumers going to shop, kind of thing. And of course, it takes energy to act in all of these production sectors. So, the talk about renewable energy sources has been entirely eclipsed because the primary domestic policy goal, certainly in the US and the rest of North America and pretty much most of the countries on Earth, the primary domestic policy goal is economic growth. And we define that at the beginning, more and more stuff. So it's not just going to be renewable sources, you know, it's like all of the above or and like the tar sands in British Columbia, you've probably seen photos from. And then, of course, you know, pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics, there's no free lunch here to get from this activity through all those productive sectors we looked at. You're going to have this stuff arise as well, the byproduct, pollution. So that's kind of a look at the economy on the ground. And now I want to kind of go back to some theoretical, conceptual considerations for a few minutes. Because if you bring this issue up, like if you talk about the conflict between economic growth and wildlife conservation, and this is what happened to me in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when I got those gag orders that Ed mentioned. The leadership in organizations like that, they haven't studied this, you know, they don't know what to think about it. So they say, okay, I heard you, Check. Now I need to go ask our economists. And that's the exact worst thing that can happen, because the economists have no ecological chops, and they typically have been taught a more recent derivative of the 1956 Solow model, Robert Solow's theory of economic growth, that won him decades later a Nobel Prize. Well, that's a long story. It's not really a Nobel Prize. It's the prize in commemoration of Alfred Nobel by the rank and Bank of Sweden or whatever it is. It's not a regular Nobel Prize. But anyway, you know, Solow started with the basic production function that tells us, yeah, production is a function of capital and labor. Well, sure. But if you notice something odd there, you probably heard capital. You might already be thinking, well, wait a minute, it's supposed to be land, labor, and capital. And no, if you're a conventional economist at the University of Chicago or MIT or Stanford or whatever, you're going to get scant coverage of land as a factor of production. There's a whole book about this, by the way, called The Corruption of Economics, no less, by Mason Gaffney. And I borrowed heavily from Gaffney's thesis in my, I think it was chapter 4 in my book, Supply Shock, because I steered his thesis directly into this production function. What the heck happened to land in the production function? And anyway, what happened to it was summarily dismissed. And there are more than just corruption explanations for why. Remember, it's mid-20th century. Resource shortages aren't so far into the radar and so on. So there's some, you know, more or less legitimate reasons, but I don't want to say much more about the corruption of economics, except for the fact that it ties in to a backlash that goes way back to Henry George in the last decade of the 20th century, when Henry George, in the very famous book called Progress and Poverty, was pitching for the single tax on land. Did I say the 20th century? I should have said the 19th century. It was in the 18th. The book was published in 1878, and George's political popularity maxed in like the 1890s when he almost won the mayor of New York race and died in the process. So then this Robert Lucas, after Solow's 1956 paper, he brought in the concept of human capital, still part of the capital complex, so didn't really get anywhere ecologically. And then Paul Romer, in the most recent significant add-on to Solow's theory, brought in the concept of endogenous technological progress. And that didn't help us at all, because it just ties into this notion that, oh, you don't have to worry about limits to growth, because we're going to get more and more proficient, efficient, productively efficient. And it's fascinating. Romer is no dummy. He is a brilliant economist. All these guys are great with math, but none of them had any ecological background to speak of. And so with Romer, he essentially ended up concluding that, okay, we need more technological progress to keep growing the economy. Now, what does that entail? That entails a labor force that's conducting research and development, or R&D. So what's the next thing you get to? You have to have a greater and greater R&D force. And what's the next thing? To have that, all else equal, ceteris paribus, as the economists might say, you have to have a growing population. So, it's totally ecologically fallacious. Now, that's one problem. That's a huge problem. And maybe it's an even bigger problem that the number one major in American academia, and maybe globally, I don't know, but certainly in the American curriculum, is business. And in a business curriculum, you're going to get a condensed, watered down version of neoclassical growth. You don't even get much of this. You just get this real crude concept of the economy comprising a circular flow of money between businesses and households, or capital and labor. And so their vision of economic growth is just a growing circular flow of money, more and more money being spent on something. That part isn't often even thought too much about. People in business school tend up going very microeconomic in practice when they get out. So in ecological macroeconomics, we emphasize the fact that circular flow of money may exist, but certainly not without its planetary context. And in fact, the whole evolution of Homo sapiens, started out with a solar system and solar energy, and then fast forwarding way into the future, money develops, and there is a circular flow to reflect the goods and services that are being consumed. But that's a process of reducing these stocks of natural capital, converting them into the product that's purchased by households and that's produced by the labor provided by the people. And again, pursuant to that second law, there will be pollutants in the form of material and heat. Here's another way of looking at it. We don't have the best. Don't tell me this doesn't work anymore. Oh, well, you have to, I guess you're going to have to envision that pig growing and a dirtier and dirtier brown cloud coming from the pig. All right. So, but there is a bit of a focus on the money aspect here too. So I want to tell you about something we have been developing at CASSE that we call the trophic theory of money. And I'm guessing you guys are largely ecologists and biologists, or you've been around ecology enough. You've heard of trophic levels, where you have in the economy of nature, the producers, the plants. They're called producers by virtue of the fact that they literally produce their own food in the process of photosynthesis. And so that's the base of the economy of nature, producers. And then if you have a substantial enough population of producers, you can support primary consumers, animals that eat those plants. And then if you have a sufficient population of primary consumers, you can support populations and species of secondary consumers, animals that eat primary consumers. And, it's obviously not that simple. You have omnivores and you have things like detritivores at the very base, and uh, you might even think of some of the species in terms of the services they provide in the economy of nature. So philosophically, we want to recognize that we're not necessarily that distinct. And theologically, maybe spiritually, and so on. That's up to people and their religions and faiths and stuff to deal with. But biologically, you know, uh, human beings are a species as well. And if we want to include them in the economy of nature, the easiest way, a way that makes a lot of sense, is to put them at the top of the trophic structure, because they can eat anything else out there that's edible, and they can harvest it, they can live anywhere, based on the technologies they've developed. And so then you can envision the growth of the human economy kind of like this. Very simple graph to help display how the growth of that human economy occurs at the exclusion, the competitive exclusion of other species in the trophic structure. It's sort of a trophic compression of non-human species. Here's another way of illustrating that fundamental conflict between economic growth and biodiversity conservation. Over time, as you grow the economy, it's a process of reallocating that natural capital: wood, water, soils, fisheries, minerals, and so on. Reallocating that from the old economy of nature, where those stocks of natural capital had simply comprised wildlife habitats. You're reallocating that to the human economy, where that stuff is transposed into producer and consumer goods. Now, I don't know how many of you guys may have been involved in the Wildlife Society or the American Fisheries Society in the past few decades. If you were, circa 1995 to 2015, thank you very much. If you had anything at all to do with our efforts, which were very difficult, let's just summarize it like that, to get the Wildlife Society to take a position on economic growth. The American Fisheries Society, on their other hand, failed by one fish, you might say. But here's a collage that speaks thousands of words. It shows the economy kind of growing in sigmoid fashion. It's coming out of the wilderness. It's developing its trophic structure from the extraction to into the service sectors, even in the urban core. And it starts out endangering these large-bodied K-selected species, and at some point, it's even endangering all these little R-selected insects as well. So, and we can describe this in one sense: due to the tremendous breadth of the human niche, which expands via technological progress, the human economy grows at the competitive exclusion of non-human species in the aggregate. So it's a long sentence, but it's a way to combine some conservation biology terms, just enough to, let them know you know what you're talking about, but yet still not get too jargony or abstruse that no one's going to understand you. So that's why at CASSI, one of our sort of pet projects is to say this or that or the other thing is a steady state economy. And when it comes to biodiversity, it's so crystal clear. Biodiversity conservation is a steady state economy. It's not going to happen with a growing economy. So back to the trophic theory of money. So we say then that not only are humans part of the economy of nature, but in the human economy itself, we parse that out. It's got its trophic structure. It's It's got to follow the same natural laws. It's got a foundation of producers. In this case, that's especially the agricultural activity. That's when we look. That's why when we looked at the economy on the ground, we started out with the grain belt, one of the grain belts of the world, Kansas over the Ogallala Aquifer. It's the agricultural and extractive activities that are required. You have to have surplus in those actors, in those activities to start having any manufacturing activity. Starting with the heaviest, and then as you develop an economy, you're essentially developing the trophic structure of the economy. And in this case, you clearly do have service providers per se, and they will operate at all levels in the trophic structure. So here it is, in a sense. The trophic theory of money is that money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor into manufacturing and service sectors. And it's not like Copernicus redevising the astronomy or anything like that. It's pretty commonsensical, and there certainly are precedents in the classical economics and even pre-classical economics of the 18th century, with Francois Quesnay writing the first model of the economy in the 1760s called the Tableau Économique. There's precedent for this knowledge. However, until we came along, it's never been put in trophic terms. So this in trophic terms. So this is our offering, especially to economists. To ecologists and ecological economists, to better describe the conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. So here, going back to that economy on the ground, here's the main point of the trophic theory of money. Before you get any of this, the most refined, the things that are supposed to dematerialize or decouple economic growth from throughput or the ecological footprint, before you ever get there, you got to have a lot of this. And to support more of this, you need ever more of this. To support ever more of this, you need ever more of this. That's basic trophic ecology. So a primary corollary of the trophic theory of money is that the quantity of money, real money, not inflated, or hyperinflated greenbacks or whatever, but quantity of real money adjusted for inflation and GDP as a flow of money. The quantity of money and the flow of money indicates the amount of agricultural surplus and related activity at the trophic base. Remember the logging and the mining and the commercial fishing. And therefore, the environmental impact of the economy. So here's kind of the way of expressing that. I have to see. Excuse me. Yeah, so the trophically structured economy, for it to grow, that agro-extractive base must grow. And that agro-extractive base, that's the last thing that's going to be decoupled from environmental impact. So that explains the fundamentality of the conflict between growth and conservation. You can't go to some imaginary services economy where everything is singing and dancing and making money. The bigger economy, it grows as an integrated whole, and it starts at this agro-extractive base. So just a little bit more on the trophic theory of money. Money exists in an economy as a supply and a flow, or a stock and a flow of money. And GDP we can view as the macroeconomic flow of money because it's the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually in a country. And here's a very handy tip if you're having a difficulty understanding like GDP and how it's relevant to environmental impact and so on. This is called the fundamental identity or formula of national income economy. An identity in math is kind of like a definition. So the identity is that production equals income equals expenditure. So it's the other thing this is doing, what I really love this fundamental identity, it's connecting, as we do in the trophic theory of money, it's connecting the real economy with the monetary economy. The real sector, if you will, and the monetary sector. And here we go. Here's the real sector of goods and services, labor helping firms produce the goods that are then consumed by the households. And by purchasing them with money. Now, if this money supply is growing, well, that's the classic example of too much money chasing too few goods. Goods aren't growing. See, they're stabilized. You might say it's a steady state economy in the real sector, but the monetary economy is growing, and so that's inflation. And forgot why we come back to this, but it's a nice reminder. There is a circular flow of money, but when you hit the planetary boundaries for a real economy, it doesn't matter if you keep throwing more money at it or into it, injecting more of a money supply, you're not going anywhere. And so that's a big part of the explanation of recent years of inflation, post-COVID inflation. Is it working this time? No. Oh, I wanted to show you guys that pig grow with the brown cloud, but oh well. So remember we talked about conventional economics and economists and how they've been perpetuating this myth that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. It's funny because the way they do that is they start by acknowledging, oh yeah, sure, as we grow the economy or we grow the population, and or we grow per capita consumption, it causes environmental stress. So growing environmental threat. But they also say that, well, that's not the end of the story, because if only we achieve a high enough GDP, especially in per capita terms, well, then we're going to be rich enough, spend enough on R&D that we'll start solving these problems while we're growing the economy. It's called the environmental Kuznets curve, after Simon Kuznets, guy who was instrumental in the development of GDP and posited or hypothesized sort of a Kuznets curve when it came to, as I recall, poverty, or distribution of wealth or something, but he wasn't a staunch defender of that. It was kind of a loose hypothesis of his. But the political economists out there really took that and ran for more yards than they ever should have got out of it. And then their cousins later, or nephews and nieces, glommed onto this environmental Kuznets curve that we just laughed at. So, but anyway, it's not entirely nonsense. They're saying that, okay, if we have a growing economy, especially in per capita terms, we can spend more on research and development. So they're talking about technological progress. And that especially refers to new technology. And it definitely refers to increasing productive efficiency. And in particular, greater efficiency from invention and innovation, right? So, well, there's something to that, but they took it way too far and they forgot to take it in the right direction. Or they didn't know what direction to take it in. And so they had embarrassing statements like Solo's infamous, "The world can, in effect, get along without natural resources." And he later, I think, kind of backpedaled from this statement, kind of made fun of it a little bit. But, oh no, the cat was out of the bag. And others, like our friend here, Robert Bradley, probably no friend of Merry Meeting Bay, but loosely speaking of he went so far as to say natural resources originate from the mine, not from the ground, and therefore are not depletable. And this is at an awards banquet where he's winning the annual award from, I think it was the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So let's just take a real quick look at this and blow it out of the water. These are the basic types of technological progress. You have explorative, extractive, and then end use. Now, I think we can see right away that if you're advancing in these types of technological progress, that's not going to help you conserve resources. It's all about finding and using even more resources. So the great hope boils down to this thing called end use technological progress, where you're getting more output per unit of input. And all right, how does that happen? Well, like Solo, I'm sorry, not Solo, but Paul Romer pointed out, well, you simply have to conduct the research and development. Yeah, but how did that happen? And when you dig into that, you can summarize that where that comes from with the word profits. It's corporate profits. It's also, more broadly speaking, economic surplus, like at the government science level, it's surplus. But then again, a lot of the government revenue comes from taxing of profits and surplus income and stuff. So we can just call it profits. But not all profits, of course, gets to go there. That's the profits left over after the consumption, the dividends are sent out, the investment, the annual Christmas party in Las Vegas type stuff. After all those expenditures, that profit can be spent on R&D. The thing is, economists of all ilks that will explain to you why profits dry up in a competitive capitalist economy. So that leads us to kind of a catch-22. It's like you need the profits for the R&D, but you need the R&D to maintain the profits. See, that's the way out of the profits drying up, is you conduct the R&D that makes your firm more competitive than the others, and in that way you can maintain a profit margin. So it's like a catch-22, and that's not really a valid way to explain anything. So there's some piece of the puzzle missing, right? And I remember finding in that awful tome by W.W. Rostow, Theorists of Economic Growth from David Hume to the Present, somewhere around page 550 or something. He specified some of the sources of growth. And in his explanation for GDP growth, and here's one of them, and I believe it's the thing that goes right here. It's called economies of scale. That's the one other way than technological progress that you can get more efficient and therefore retain a competitive advantage over other firms. Economies of scale. And those just mean a reduced cost per unit of output. And, you get these internally, like within a corporation like Weyerhaeuser, externally within a sector like the timber industry. And we could say they operate macroeconomically because there's this concept called total factor productivity. The thing to really emphasize here is economies of scale are not at all about technological progress. They're by definition based in the current levels of technology. So it's increased efficiency, yes, but concomitantly with an increase in aggregate production at that current level of technology. See, so you didn't escape that fundamental conflict. Every once in a while, there may be a really memorable or really historically notable event of technological progress, like maybe replacing organochlorines or replacing CFCs as refrigerants and staving off the threat of the ozone depletion, things like that. But as long as you're continuing to depend upon technological progress, it's going to require a growing economy and those economies of scale. Okay, so I'm going to try to start winding it down now. I did want to just say a few things about optimum scale, because we've talked about growth, degrowth, and the steady state, finding that one to be sustainable. But let's say we're in the $27 trillion American economy or the $107 trillion global economy. It's at the optimal level. And I think the main point I want to make here is that maybe for the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, we're probably beyond the optimum level. I know for me it is. I'm a wilderness aficionado. I was a large mammal biologist out west. I miss all that stuff. I miss those ecosystems. I go a lot of places these days that I was in the past, and it's gone. So, but then you have a lot of others who don't have that kind of appreciation. They would like the world to be like New York City. So this is like the big challenge for a democratic polity in the 21st century, to muddle toward the social optimum for GDP, the democratic optimum. And this is just another way of looking at the optimum, and you guys may remember Herman Daly, the great Herman Daly. He liked to call GDP growth past the optimum uneconomic growth to make a point, just a little more technically put, it's when the marginal disutility of a unit of GDP exceeds the marginal utility. Well, that's uneconomic. You're losing more than you're gaining. It's costing more than you're receiving. It's dumb growth. So there's some metrics that in this struggle for a democratic polity to figure out the optimum scale, some metrics that can be used, like the ecological footprint, the genuine savings, the living planet index, the millennium assessment, and so on. You get the picture. And there's just a lot more of this work and focus starting in academia and building out into public education and public policy to help us get toward but for a lot of us, it seems pretty clear already with things like the burgeoning list of endangered species, the greenhouse gas loading of the atmosphere, and a lot of resource shortages that are threatening our kids and grandkids' economies. It's pretty clear that we're beyond a safe bet for GDP. So, this is an old. We have called it now the Steady State Economy Act. We're developing an omnibus bill to replace the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act of 1978. Can you believe that? The U.S. has, don't let them tell you it's some laissez-faire capitalism. There's a centrally planned, to a substantial degree, economy that's based on a 1978 law, the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, or FEBGA. It's way out of date, and we need to reform it with some of these common sense approaches, and go all the way into what we might call steady statesmanship in international diplomacy as well as domestic policy. Here's just the quickest look at that. You know, the UN is probably the best starting place for that. And what would be scrutinized is the ecological footprint of countries, of regions, geopolitical regions. And for some of these geopolitical regions, it's all a matter of the personal consumption expenditures, or in other words, per capita GDP. Whereas in other regions, the Asian Pacific region in general, this is definitely outdated some. This would be up a little higher and this would be a little further in, but still the same basic picture. It's more a matter of population size in that region. But whatever it is, you know, that's got to be dealt with. And fortunately, with the trophic theory of money, it doesn't entail some impossible sort of ecological monitoring. We know that to have greater expenditures, you have that expanding agro-extractive base that's environmentally impacting. So this place more impacting than this place. This place is more impacting than this place. This place more impacting. Now in this area, it's primarily because of population. In this area, it's primarily because of per capita consumption. So that's something that's got to be wrestled with in steady statesmanship. Oh, I thought that's what. Oh, this is actually a map of using an ecological footprint, a rough map of that. But our point at CASI is you don't even have to do that. You can use GDP per capita, and you can map it out a lot finer than this. You know, you could map it out every bit as finely as this map. Okay, so, and then by doing that, the idea is to get those nations with true devastating poverty up above that poverty line and cut out the fat of really overgrown economies so that you have sort of a contraction and convergence, you might say, into a sustainable global steady state. Yeah, like that. Okay, well, you know, I know you guys are action takers, action oriented. So I'm only going to suggest a couple real minor things here. First of all, you can, of course, sign the CASI position on economic growth. I'm not sure if this will actually go to a website from here, so I'll try it right at the end. And we would love to have the Friends of Merrimack Bay endorse the CASI position, and joining the likes of E.O. Wilson and Jane Goodall, the late in both cases. Jane Goodall and David Suzuki and Vandana Shiva and Gus, Beth, etc. You know, we have a lot of the real champions of conservation. We have chapters. We'd love to have a Cassie chapter start up somewhere up there in your neck of the woods. We've got a project called the Keep Our Counties Great campaign. That's for counties, towns, townships when they do their comprehensive planning, to use that comprehensive planning mechanism as a way to get off the growth path and move toward a steady state. And so, we just like to remind people that if we're talking about winning the wars, maybe it's not the best metaphor. Help me think of something else. But if we want to win the war, not just some battles here and there, we have to advocate for this too, and maybe more than anything else. Because like we like to say at Cassie, environmental protection, it is a steady state economy. And if you're going to have a sustainable jobs, sustainable economy in the future, that needs a protected environment, and so it is a steady state economy. And if countries keep pushing for GDP growth, it goes from Cold War to hot war, and so peace is a steady state economy. So thank you, and let's see if this guy works, and then I'll stop talking here. Oh yeah, it goes to the website. So, and at the bottom of the page, there's this giant blue button. You can go there and sign the position. Well, I would just ask folks to consider doing that while this is fresh in your memory. That would really be wonderful. You'd be joining just the greatest group of almost 17,000 people now. Name's going to show up, name and town. Any other data is totally behind the scenes. And then, you know, we have these organizations that have endorsed the Cassie position. So that's it for my talk, folks. I don't want to hog any more of our time, and would love to chat with you. So I'll pull that off the thing now and open it up. I don't know if I need to check the chat room or if anyone's moderating the discussion or.
Yeah, hey Brian, thank you very much. Appreciate that. That was really interesting. I nothing in the chat so far,
Oh,
but
I didn't put you to sleep, did I?
I'm still. I do want to say that on my screen, the link to the steady state letter didn't come on. I know it did on yours because it's on your computer. I also will say I think that Friends of Miramichi Bay signed on to that a little while ago. I think I did that.
Oh,
And I don't know if this way that, you know, if I can go on, you know, as an outsider and check and see who signed on or not.
Yeah.
I think I tried anyway. And then we do have a main chapter. And I don't know exactly what the relationship is between local chapters of Cassie and your group, and maybe you could elaborate on that. But I have a question that, you know, as we talked about this before, a lot of us have, you know, read about Small is Beautiful or Limits to Growth, things like that over the years. I used to contribute to, at that time, Zero Population Growth, ZPG. I get really pissed off when they changed their name to something that was like, what does this mean? Talk about the relationship between population and steady state economy. Is one equal to the other or not necessarily? And if they don't, how do we bring up the standard of living and quality of life for so many people in the world that don't have that without growing the GDP, say, at least in those places?
Yeah. Well, so the first,
Population versus steady state, and how do we bring people up in the world?
yeah. Well, the steady state economy is not exactly equal to a stabilized population. However, a steady state economy definitely entails or requires a stabilized population, yeah. But you also have to have stabilized per capita consumption for a steady state economy. And population and per capita consumption tend to go hand in hand when there's still available resources, when you're still below carrying capacity. For the reasons spelled out, we'll give them some credit in conventional economics. You know, as you have a growing population, you have more diversification, you have more technological progress, and you can increase in that way, and through economies of scale. Remember, you can have a greater GDP per capita as well. When you start to bump up against limits to growth, though, and a lot of countries are already at that bumping, then normally the thing that'll start to drop off first is the per capita consumption. And that should be a red flag. That should be a warning to the people that, first of all, they should probably stop pushing for GDP growth, and including should stop pushing for any more population growth. And the second part of your question, how do you lift up the people in countries where there is widespread poverty? Well, that's the stuff of steady statesmanship in international diplomacy. It's the international version of redistribution of wealth within a nation as well, among individuals. And so at CASI, our approach, starting within the nation, is, well, one part of the approach is the Salary Cap Act. We don't think there should be a trillionaire in the US. We don't think there should be very many billionaires at all. And our Salary Cap Act, it's a feeder bill to the Steady State Economy Act. We don't expect it to be politically feasible right now on Capitol Hill. It's not, but it's definitely some really nourishing food for political thought. We say no one should get more than the President of the United States, because we think that ought to resonate with quite a few people. Why do we have, athletes and techies and this, when the person who's supposed to be bearing some of the greatest weight on their shoulders in the world is getting 10 times or 100 times less? And they're at the amount that society has agreed they should be paid. So let's keep our salaries within that level. And that would, with that type of flattening, we would solve the unsustainability of, or a lot of the unsustainability of, the per capita consumption problem. International affairs, we have drafted what we call the Sustainable Population and Immigration Act. And then once again, that's focused on the US, but one of the sections calls for the establishment of an aid in place fund, the aid in place fund. The idea there is that the US it's a rich economy. It's a fat economy. It's got to get its act together internally, once again, with the distribution of wealth, so everybody is fine. But then there's still going to be fat in the economy. And if we want to stabilize borders and have, cultural and national security and so on, and be a good citizen on the planet, we should try to help in the parts of the world where the poverty drives people to such desperation that they would risk life and limb to get to this place. So we call it the Aid in Place Fund. And we don't have the staff to have fleshed out what the Aid in Place federal program would include in great detail. But it would be education, it would be women's empowerment in a number of ways. It would be resource in education and and possibly even simply some wealth transfer in some cases.
Yeah, well, as you said, it's within countries as well. Don't need to go abroad to find those discrepancies. Interesting, just last week, the Tesla shareholders, as you probably heard, voted strongly in favor of upping Elon Musk's salary based on some goals, fulfilling some goals to something unheard of. I forget if it's $1 trillion or what it was. It was crazy. So even people in the, hesitate to call him rank and file, but he didn't make that up on his own. They endorsed it at least. And so there's obviously a lot of philosophical change that has to happen to get to where, you and maybe we would like to see this go. And do we have time? It's kind of iffy, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're way behind as a society in dealing with limits to growth. But like my brother used to say, what's the use of not trying?
Yep.
You gotta, there's that question, where do you start? Well, you start where you start. You are where you are, and take
Yep.
one step at a time. And I like to encourage people by pointing out that we have two really, really powerful allies on our side. That the perpetual growthers don't, that the green growthers don't either. That's sound science and common sense.
Hmm.
The common sense about limits to growth, it may be a kind of a latent common sense because it never gets any political exercise because we don't have political leadership that acknowledges it. Or there was some when Jimmy Carter was president, some high level political leadership to acknowledge limits to growth and so on. And that could easily come back. And then if it does, that's going to resonate big time with the common sense, that latent common sense that people have. They're going to say, oh, yeah, of course. Why are we still pushing for more and more people, more and more stuff, more red lights, more noise, more congestion, more crowding, more stress, less water, less timber, less fish.
I think in politics, we often see a bouncing from one extreme maybe to the other, or maybe not extremes, but it's sort of like paralleling that space where the steady state economy lives, and going from one, the bottom side to the top side. And we can hope that maybe there'll be a reaction, to the current administration that takes us back more in the Carter direction.
Yeah, we can hope for that. And if you have like Mayor Meeting Bay members that are politically active in that, and that's a great way to frame the critique of Trump is he's doing all these crazy things because he's just hell bent on GDP growth. You don't hear this in the regular news coverage and stuff, but very early on in his first term, I mean, he pointed out he wanted to be the king of GDP. He wanted to have the fastest growing economy, biggest economy. Um, and it's a bit ironic because he's doing a number of things that aren't exactly great for GDP growth. We're just lucky in that regard, I would say.
I think it's more about gross personal wealth. So, but
Right.
it's just a lights and sirens time. You probably haven't seen it, but in your window behind you, there's flashing LEDs back there. I don't know if there's the
Oh,
cops are out there, the fire department, or
oh, that's a gas company
okay.
that's yeah, doing some repairs. Thanks for
We
pointing
don't
that
we
out.
don't have sirens going, but we have flashing lights. The flashing lights time. So,
Right.
what what
Yeah.
about what about the state chapters? What are they about, or the local chapters?
Well, we leave our chapters to kind of do their own thing. We kind of vet people that want to be a chapter director, make sure they're not going to go, nuts or anything. And there's a few things we like to avoid. Like we don't take a hard stance on any particular model of political economy. We don't say, we're not Marxists, and we're not laissez-faire capitalists. We're not uh, the Politburo. We're not kings, and we feel like the steady state economy uh, can be attained in different parts of the world with different models of political economy that depend really on like cultural and historical factors and
Mhm.
even economic.
Right. Well,
But so a chapter, though, to get to your question, that depends a lot on the the chapter director. It might be a student, might be a graduate student at a university, and their efforts are going to be more focused like on university curriculum and events, book readings, and maybe authoring papers. And we've had chapter directors that operated at like a provincial scale. Like we had one in Australia who was the New South Wales chapter director, and he was extremely productive. He got the Australian Academy of Science to devote their annual environmental conference to the steady state economy one year. And
right.
he wrote some books. And by the way, we publish books. So if we have some authors out there who um, I mean, we like to publish only really polished and extremely relevant stuff, but it doesn't have to be full of economic policy to be very relevant. Like we published one book that might resonate up in that neck of the woods called "If Thoreau Had a Bike." It's a pretty clever book. It's by this avid bicyclist,
Mhm.
um, American expat living in Paris and using only a bicycle. And he's a philosopher and fan and student of Thoreau, and so kind of borrowed Thoreau's points about what was it, riding train versus or walking versus taking a train or whatever that was way back then. And he has converted that same sort of philosophy into biking places instead of public transport, much less personal vehicles. And it's very well done. Um,
Okay.
just an example of how you know you can get all the way down to lifestyle issues that are very relevant to advancing the steady state economy.
Well, I'd encourage people to go to your website, track down the main chapter. We had a presenter a number of years ago, Steve Coughlin from the University of Maine, talking about sea lampreys, a wonderful presentation. And Steve is the main chapter president, and I don't know what the chapter is doing, but I think we should close. We got a few people still hanging on, but
Oh, yeah, I'll
and the screen
shut
is
this off then. But
few people hanging
I
on. We've gone a long time, so I want to thank you again, Brian. Your website is steadystate.org, I think. Is that right?
Yes, steadystate.org. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Brian, and hopefully we'll see you in December and we'll learn about bald eagles, of which we now have lots and lots.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, you guys. Have a good evening. Keep up the good work up there, please.
Talk to you later. Thanks, Brian.
Bye now.